Guys, you won't believe what happened when I found my daughter in the parking lot with her baby and all her bags. She told me they had changed the locks, and her father-in-law accused her of stealing money. I just smiled and said, "Get in the car." But what I did next completely stunned everyone. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I'd love to hear. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this. Now let me tell you exactly what went down and how I handled the situation. Let me tell you a little about myself. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I live here in Lakewood Terrace, Charlotte, North Carolina. It's a quiet little neighborhood with streets lined with maple trees that turn gold every fall. My husband, George, God rest his soul, passed away 10 years ago. A good man, steady and kind, but life has a way of testing us, doesn't it? My heart has always belonged to my daughter, Madeline Carter. From the moment she was born, I knew I would do anything to protect her. I watched her grow, saw her take her first steps, and wipe away her first tears. When she married Ryan Mitchell, I cried at the ceremony, proud yet nervous, knowing that no matter how much she loved him, my love for her would always be hers to rely on. And then came Ava, my little granddaughter, 8 months old now. Holding her for the first time was like holding the world in my arms. I promised myself I would always watch over her, just like I always have for Madeline. The night my daughter called me is a night I will never forget. Not because anything dramatic happened at first, but because of how ordinary it felt right before everything changed. It was a cool Wednesday evening in early October. I had just finished reviewing some paperwork in my home office when my phone lit up on the desk. The name on the screen was Madeline Carter, my daughter. Now, when you've been a mother for as many years as I have, you learn to recognize certain things. Sometimes a call feels casual, like someone just checking in. But sometimes the moment you see that name on the screen, something in your chest tells you this call matters. I answered immediately. "Madeline, sweetheart?" For a second there was nothing but the sound of wind through the phone. Then I heard a soft cry in the background. My granddaughter Ava Carter, only 8 months old. Madeline spoke quietly. "Mom." Her voice sounded tight, the way it does when someone is trying very hard not to fall apart. "Yes, honey, what's wrong?" "I'm in the parking lot outside my office building." I straightened in my chair. "Why are you still there?" "It's almost 8. Madeline worked as a marketing coordinator at a small design firm called Brightline Creative in downtown Charlotte, North Carolina. Her hours were usually long, but she was never this late. She took a slow breath. "Ryan locked me out of the house." "Ryan?" "My son-in-law, Ryan Mitchell." I thought I had misunderstood. "What do you mean he locked you out?" "He texted me about 20 minutes ago," she said softly. "He said the locks had been changed and that maybe I should stay somewhere else for a while." Behind her, little Ava started fussing louder, the tired cry of a baby who didn't understand why she was still outside. I closed my eyes for a moment. Then I stood up. "Madeline," I said calmly as I grabbed my coat, "listen to me carefully. Okay. Stay exactly where you are." A small pause. "Don't leave that parking lot." "All right. I'll be there in 5 minutes." You see, Madeline's office building was only a few blocks away from my condo. One of those quiet conveniences life sometimes gives you. My driver, Henry Lewis, was already waiting downstairs. "Brightline Creative Building," I told him as I slid into the back seat. Henry nodded and pulled into traffic without another word. The city lights blurred past the windows as we turned onto Briarwood Avenue. The streets were damp from a light rain that had passed through earlier that evening, leaving the pavement shining under the streetlights. When we pulled into the nearly empty office parking lot, I saw her right away. Madeline was standing near a row of darkened cars under a tall lamppost. She was still wearing her work clothes, a beige blazer and black slacks, and she held Ava against her shoulder. At her feet sat a small canvas duffel bag, everything she had managed to bring with her. The car hadn't fully stopped before I opened the door and stepped out. Madeline looked up when she heard the door close. The moment she saw me walking toward her, her shoulders dropped slightly, the way someone relaxes when they finally see a familiar face. I gently took Ava from her arms. "Well, hello there, Miss Ava," I murmured softly. The baby blinked at me with sleepy eyes and grabbed onto my bracelet with surprising determination. I carried her to the back seat and buckled her carefully into the baby carrier I always kept in the car. Preparedness is something you learn with age. When I turned back toward Madeline, the light above us flickered slightly. That's when I noticed the faint bruise forming along her cheekbone. It wasn't dramatic, just enough to make a mother's heart tighten. I didn't ask about it. Not yet. Instead, I stepped closer and placed my hands gently on either side of her face the way I used to when she was little and came home from school after a bad day. "Madeline Carter," I said softly, "get in the car." She nodded right away. No argument. No explanation. That quiet obedience worried me more than anything she could have said. The drive to my home in Lakewood Terrace took about 20 minutes. Madeline stared silently out the window the whole time. Ava fell asleep before we even left the parking lot, her tiny hand still wrapped around the edge of my bracelet. I didn't fill the silence with questions, because when someone's life has just cracked open, the first thing they need is an interrogation. They need somewhere safe. Everything else can wait. By the time we arrived at my house, the porch lights were glowing warmly. My housekeeper, Linda Morales, had already turned down the guest bed earlier that afternoon, something she often did when Madeline visited. I carried Ava upstairs and laid her gently in the portable crib beside the bed. Madeline stood in the doorway watching quietly. "You should take a hot shower," I told her softly. "There are clean clothes in the bathroom." She nodded slowly. "And I'll make some tea." While Madeline went upstairs, I walked into the kitchen and put the kettle on. Chamomile. The same tea I had given her when she was a teenager and life felt too heavy. While the water heated, I walked into my study and stood by the window. Outside stood the tall maple tree I had planted the year I bought this house 27 years earlier. Back then it had been just me, a small consulting business, and a stubborn determination to build something steady. That tree had grown strong roots over the years. So had I. Madeline came downstairs about an hour later wearing an oversized North Carolina State sweatshirt she had left here years ago. It hung loosely on her frame, making her look younger than 31. Madeline sat across from me at the kitchen island that night, both hands wrapped around the mug of chamomile tea like she was borrowing warmth from it. For a few minutes she just stared at the steam rising from the cup. Upstairs, little Ava Carter was sleeping quietly in the guest room. The house was calm, the kind of calm that comes after a storm has passed, but before anyone knows how much damage it left behind. Finally Madeline spoke. "It started about a month after Ava was born," she said softly. I nodded, letting her continue at her own pace. "You remember when Ryan Mitchell convinced us to move into his parents' house?" Of course I remembered. Ryan's father, Victor Mitchell, had offered them the place as a gift shortly after their wedding. A large two-story house in Stonebridge Heights, one of those quiet neighborhoods with trimmed hedges and wide driveways. At the time it had sounded generous. A place for a young couple to start their life. Madeline had been excited. Ryan had insisted it would help them save money. I had smiled politely at the dinner table when the offer was made. But that following Monday morning, I had made 2 quiet phone calls. Not because I distrusted my daughter, but because I never trusted arrangements that came with no paperwork. Madeline took another sip of tea. "At first it was fine," she continued. "Actually, it felt wonderful. I could picture it. Madeline decorating the nursery. Ryan bringing home takeout dinners. The excitement of preparing for their first baby." But then her voice shifted slightly. "After Ava was born, things started to change." "How?" I asked gently. She sighed. "Little comments at first. Her mother-in-law, Sharon Mitchell, had begun stopping by more often. At first it seemed harmless. Sharon would walk through the kitchen making observations. She would say things like, Madeline paused, "You're holding the baby too much. You'll spoil her." Or, "You really should organize the pantry better." And sometimes, "Are you sure you know how to manage a household?" Madeline gave a small, tired smile. At first I thought she was just being helpful. But over the weeks the visits became longer and louder. Sharon Mitchell had opinions about everything. How Madeline dressed the baby, how she cooked dinner, how she cleaned the house, even how she spoke to Ryan. "And Ryan?" I asked quietly. Madeline stared at the table for a moment. "He would just laugh it off." That didn't surprise me. Ryan Mitchell had always preferred comfort over confrontation. Then Madeline said something that made me pay closer attention. About 3 months ago, Victor offered me a job. His company was called Clearview Wellness Network, a group of outpatient health clinics spread around the Charlotte area. Victor Mitchell had been very proud of it. According to him, it was his life's work. He said they needed someone organized to help manage scheduling and operations. Madeline explained. Office coordinator. Good salary. Regular hours. She had been thrilled. After months at home with the baby, the idea of returning to professional work felt exciting. "I thought I had earned it," she said quietly. And she had. Madeline had always been hardworking and meticulous. But there was something she didn't know. That same week Victor offered her the position, I had quietly suggested her name to someone on the hiring committee. Not directly, just a polite recommendation through a mutual acquaintance. I wanted to see how they treated her when they believed no one influential was paying attention. Madeline continued. For a while the job was good. But then her shoulders tightened slightly. Then the money arguments started. What kind of arguments? She hesitated. Credit cards. Apparently Sharon had stormed into the kitchen one afternoon waving printed bank statements. Large purchases circled in red marker. Furniture. Online orders. Even several ATM withdrawals. She said I had opened credit cards and was draining family accounts. Madeline shook her head slowly. I had never even seen those cards. She had tried to explain. Tried to show Ryan the statements didn't belong to her. But he just stared at them, she said quietly. And then he looked at me like he didn't recognize me. That night had turned into an argument. Voices raised. Doors slammed. Sharon insisting Madeline was lying. Victor quietly backing his wife. And Ryan standing in the middle, unsure which side to believe. Madeline rubbed her hands together nervously. Tonight Sharon came over again while Ryan was still at work. What happened? She had more papers, Madeline said. She said the bank had flagged new charges. When Madeline tried to leave the room, Sharon blocked the doorway. The conversation turned into shouting. Ryan arrived home halfway through it. Madeline had expected him to calm the situation. Instead he had looked at the papers, sighed, and said something that still made her voice tremble. Maybe you should take some time away until we figure this out. I leaned forward slightly. And the bruise? Madeline looked down at the table. Her fingers tightened around the mug. I was trying to leave the kitchen, she said quietly. Ryan grabbed my arm to stop me. My face hit the edge of a cabinet door when I turned. She said it calmly. Too calmly. I nodded slowly. And placed that information in the careful place in my mind where important details live. Madeline exhaled slowly. I went to work today thinking things would cool down. Instead she had received a message from Ryan at the end of the day. The text was simple. The locks are changed. We need space. Figure something out. And that was how my daughter ended up standing in a dark parking lot, with a baby and one small bag. The kitchen clock ticked softly on the wall. I stood up and gently took her empty mug. Go upstairs and get some sleep, I told her. Madeline looked up. Mom, what am I going to do? I placed a hand on her shoulder. You're going to rest tonight. And tomorrow? I gave her a small, calm smile. Tomorrow we start asking questions. Because something about this story didn't feel like a misunderstanding. Felt like a plan. And if someone had built a plan around my daughter, they were about to discover something important about me. I had been building plans of my own for a very long time. Madeline went upstairs that night without arguing. I listened to her footsteps slowly fade down the hallway until the guest room door closed. A few minutes later the house grew quiet again. The kind of quiet that only happens after everyone else is asleep. I stood at the kitchen window for a long moment, looking out at the backyard where the old maple tree swayed gently in the wind. That tree had been there for nearly 3 decades. I planted it the year I started my first business. Back then I had very little. But I had patience. And patience, when used properly, can become a powerful thing. After a while I walked into my study, closed the door behind me and picked up my phone. There was only one person I trusted for the kind of work I needed done. His name was Calvin Brooks. Calvin had spent nearly 20 years working as a financial investigator before opening his own private consulting firm. Over the last 15 years he had helped me quietly verify more contracts, partnerships, and financial arrangements than I could count. He answered on the second ring. "Evening, Mrs. Carter." "Calvin," I said, settling into the chair behind my desk. "I need you to look into something for me." There was a brief pause on the line. "What kind of something?" "Everything tied to Clearview Wellness Network." That was the company run by my son-in-law's father, Victor Mitchell. Payroll accounts, vendor contracts, credit lines, anything connected to their financial structure over the last 3 years. Calvin didn't sound surprised. He never did. "How soon do you need it?" 48 hours. Another short pause. "Understood. One more thing," I added. "Check if there are any credit cards opened under the name Madeline Carter that she didn't authorize." "Identity theft?" "I believe so." Calvin made a quiet note on his end. "I'll call you when I have something." When the call ended, I remained sitting in my study for a while. Outside, the wind rustled through the leaves of the maple tree. I thought about the night Madeline first introduced me to Ryan Mitchell. He had seemed polite, well-spoken, ambitious, but I had also noticed something else. A certain eagerness in his father's eyes whenever finances came up in conversation. Victor Mitchell liked to talk about success, about how he had built Clearview Wellness from the ground up, about how he planned to expand it across the state, about how family loyalty was the most important value in business. I had smiled and nodded at the time, but I had also quietly looked into the structure of his company. Not deeply, just enough to understand what kind of foundations that family stood on. Because when your daughter marries into a family, it's wise to know what kind of foundations that family stands on. Calvin arrived at my house 2 mornings later just after 7. He carried a thin gray folder tucked under one arm. Calvin Brooks was a tall man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of careful eyes that notice details most people miss. He sat across from me in the study and placed the folder on the desk. "I found what you asked for," he said. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were several documents. The first page made my stomach tighten slightly. 3 credit cards, Calvin said calmly. All opened in Madeline Carter's name within the last 16 months. Total balance? Just over $39,000. I flipped through the purchase records. Luxury hotel reservations, home renovation materials, several large ATM withdrawals. Madeline has never stayed in any of these hotels, I said quietly. Calvin nodded. I assumed as much. What about the credit applications? Submitted online using her social security number. I closed the folder for a moment and rested my hands on the desk. How long ago did the first one appear? 5 months after her wedding to Ryan Mitchell. So it had started early. Not a desperate decision. A plan. Calvin slid another document across the desk. There's more. This page showed Clearview Wellness payroll records. Or at least part of them. About 8 months ago, Calvin explained, Clearview switched payroll processing companies. Why? That's the interesting part. He pointed to a highlighted section. The new payroll vendor is registered under the name Elaine Carter. I frowned slightly. Who is that? Calvin flipped another page. Elaine Parker is actually Sharon Mitchell, your daughter's mother-in-law. She had registered the company under her maiden name, which meant they were routing payroll transactions through their own shell company, I said slowly. Calvin nodded once. Exactly. Employee payroll fees, processing costs, vendor service charges. Small amounts taken from hundreds of transactions. Enough to avoid attention. Enough to build a quiet stream of money. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the study window. The maple tree was glowing golden in the morning sunlight. When did they start using Madeline's identity? I asked. Calvin checked his notes. For months after the wedding. So my daughter's trust had been part of the plan from the beginning. I closed the folder slowly. Then I looked back at Calvin. Freeze every overdraft credit line connected to Clearview's operating accounts. His eyebrows lifted slightly. That will stop their vendor payments within 72 hours. I know. And the payroll processor? Terminate the contract. Calvin nodded. Fraud clause. Yes. I wrote that clause myself. Several years ago, when one of Victor Mitchell's clinics leased property through a holding company I owned, I had insisted on a very detailed vendor fraud protection section. Victor had signed it without reading carefully. Most people do. Calvin closed the folder. You suspected something like this? I hoped I was wrong. But I wasn't. No. I stood up and walked toward the window. Down the hall I could hear my granddaughter, Ava Carter, beginning to stir in her crib. Small noises. Soft little kicks against the mattress. I turned back toward Calvin. There's one more thing I want to know. What's that? Find anyone who used to work for Clearview and left suddenly. Anyone who might have seen something they weren't supposed to. Calvin nodded slowly. Whistleblowers. Possibly. He stood up and gathered his notes. I'll start looking today. After he left, I walked upstairs to check on Ava. She was awake now, lying on her back in the crib, happily grabbing at her own toes. When she saw me, she made a delighted little sound. I leaned down and let her grab my finger. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so small. Well, I whispered gently, it seems your grandmother has a few questions to ask. And somewhere in the city, someone had already started realizing that their carefully constructed little operation was beginning to fall apart. They just didn't know yet who had pulled the first thread. 3 days after Calvin Brooks left my study with a new list of instructions, he called me again. It was early afternoon. I was sitting on the back patio while Ava Carter played on a blanket beside me, happily chewing on a rubber giraffe that seemed to fascinate her beyond reason. My phone buzzed on the table. Mrs. Carter, Calvin said when I answered. You found someone, I replied. He gave a small breath of approval. Yes, ma'am. Her name is Monica Hayes. I leaned back in my chair. Tell me about her. She worked at Clearview Wellness Network for almost 4 years. Billing supervisor at their original clinic on Hawthorne Street. And she was terminated about 18 months ago. For what reason? Calvin paused slightly. Officially? Mishandling patient billing records. Unofficially, I thought. What actually happened? She discovered irregularities in the payroll vendor system, he said. She reported it internally. And then, 2 weeks later, she was fired. That told me everything I needed to know. Where is she now? She works at a small accounting office downtown. I looked down at Ava, who had managed to drop the giraffe and was now deeply interested in the tassel on the corner of the blanket. Set up a meeting, I said. Don't tell her who I am. What should I say? Tell her the property owner of the Hawthorne Street Clinic wants to talk about Clearview. Calvin was quiet for a moment. She might not trust that. Tell her anyway. He gave a short laugh. Understood. Monica Hayes arrived at my house later that afternoon. She stepped through the front door with the careful posture of someone who had spent the last year learning not to expect good news from strangers. She looked to be in her late 30s, with dark hair tied neatly at the back and reading glasses resting on top of her head. In her hand she carried a canvas tote bag that read, "Books before business." That small detail made me smile. We sat in the living room across from each other while my housekeeper, Linda Morales, brought tea. Monica watched me closely. Not rudely, just carefully. Finally she spoke. Mr. Brooks said you had questions about Clearview Wellness. I do, I said. And before I ask them, I want to tell you something first. She waited. So I explained. I told her about Madeline Carter, my daughter. About the credit cards opened in her name. About the payroll processing company secretly owned by Sharon Mitchell. About the financial records Calvin had uncovered. Monica listened without interrupting. But I could see the moment the pieces began to connect in her mind. Her posture changed slightly. Her eyes sharpened. When I finished speaking, she placed her teacup carefully on the table. The discrepancy I found, she said slowly, was about $46,000 over the course of a year. I nodded. That matches our estimates. It came from patient refund accounts, she continued. Small transfers, irregular timing. Enough to avoid automatic alerts. Who had access to that system? 2 people. She held up 2 fingers. Victor Mitchell and his son Ryan Mitchell. Yes. I felt a quiet certainty settle inside me. What happened when you reported it? I asked. Monica gave a small, humorless smile. I was told I had misunderstood the accounting structure. By who? Ryan Mitchell. Of course. He said the transactions were part of a legacy vendor account from an older clinic acquisition. And you believed him? Not really. She leaned forward slightly. I asked for documentation. And 2 weeks later I was fired. For mishandling patient data. She nodded. They built the paperwork after the fact. That didn't surprise me. People who think they're clever often believe a stack of documents can replace truth. Monica reached down and opened the tote bag she had brought with her. From inside she removed a large manila envelope and placed it gently on the coffee table between us. I've been carrying this around for 18 months, she said, waiting for someone who actually cared enough to look. I opened the envelope. Inside were neatly organized records, screenshots of internal transaction logs, printed vendor reports, copies of internal emails. Every page dated and carefully labeled. The work of someone who had known from the beginning that she might someday need proof. I looked up at her. Monica Hayes, I said quietly, how would you feel about coming back to Clearview Wellness? Her eyebrows lifted. You're serious? The current leadership won't be there much longer. She studied my face. What would my job be? Billing director. With back pay for the last 18 months. Monica leaned back in her chair slowly. For a moment she didn't say anything. Then she smiled. Not a big smile. Just the quiet kind people have when something they almost gave up on finally turns around. I'd like that very much, she said. That evening, after Monica left, I sat again in my study looking through the documents she had given me. Outside, the maple tree rustled softly in the wind. Every piece of the puzzle was now in place. The fraudulent credit cards, the payroll shell company, the stolen refund funds, the intimidation, the lies. They had believed no one important was watching. They had believed my daughter was alone. But they had made one mistake. They had forgotten who her mother was. and very soon everyone in the city was going to remember. The morning air in Lakewood Terrace was crisp, carrying the faint scent of maple leaves and distant coffee from the cafe on the corner. I watched from the kitchen window as little Ava played in her sandbox on the porch, tiny hands shielding herself from the cool breeze. She was blissfully unaware of the storm quietly gathering around her family. I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea, letting the steam curl upward. Every plan, every move was slowly falling into place. Madeline had slept longer than usual, finally allowing herself the rest she desperately needed. I let her indulge in it. Strength would be essential for the battles ahead. My phone buzzed softly. Calvin Brooks. "Morning, Mrs. Carter," he said, calm and deliberate. "Morning, Calvin. Any updates?" "Yes. Monica Hayes has agreed to return to Clearview. She's securing the evidence she collected and will ensure it remains intact." I smiled faintly. That meant the first layer of the plan was ready. "Also," he continued, "I located 2 former employees, one from payroll, one from accounting. Both confirmed serious irregularities with no plausible explanation. They're prepared to give statements under confidentiality. Patience was a weapon I had honed for decades." "Excellent," I said. "Now we put them in a position where their own misdeeds expose them. Publicly if possible." By late afternoon I was ready. I had arranged a small gathering under the pretense of a neighborhood charity committee meeting. Not too large, just enough for certain ears to notice. Sharon and Ryan Mitchell had RSVP'd. I wore a dark green silk blouse with a black skirt. Nothing flashy but sharp. My hair pulled back neatly, silver streaks catching the sun. Madeline and little Ava were safely at a friend's home. No risk, no distraction. Sharon arrived first, perfectly poised, her smile tight. Ryan followed, trying to appear casual, but every step betrayed his nerves. "Sharon, Ryan," I said warmly, clasping their hands. "So glad you could make it." Sharon smiled, brittle and forced. I let the silence linger. "Oh, I almost forgot," I murmured, pretending to shuffle papers. I asked Monica Hayes to review some of Clearview's records before approving the charity's donation schedule. She's been very thorough. Sharon's eyes flicked toward me, quick, calculating. "Monica has discovered some discrepancies," I said slowly. "Errors that could affect the clinic's finances." Ryan shifted in his seat. Sharon's voice tightened. "Errors?" "Yes," I said softly, letting my gaze sweep across them. "Dating back over a year. Patient refunds, vendor payments, payroll misappropriations." The cracks in their composure appeared. Tiny but unmistakable. "Monica has documented everything," I added. "Perhaps you'd like to explain it?" Sharon froze. Ryan's jaw tightened. Their perfect control was faltering. "You believed Madeline was alone," I said, voice steady. "You believed I was out of reach. You thought your plan was perfect. But you underestimated one thing, a mother. A grandmother. Someone who sees what others choose to hide." Sharon's hands trembled ever so slightly. I saw it. The mask was slipping. "I know about the $46,000, I continued. "The transfers, the shell company, the payroll misappropriations. Every false accusation you made against my daughter. Every attempt to isolate her and make her doubt herself." I let it hang. The room thickened with tension. "Now," I said finally, "Monica has her roll back, the accounts are frozen, and Calvin Brooks has prepared statements from whistleblowers. By the time this meeting ends, your carefully constructed system of deceit will be exposed." They said nothing. "Not yet." I smiled softly, almost like a grandmother watching a chessboard. Every piece in place, every move accounted for. "And now," I said, turning toward the window as the afternoon sun glinted off the maple leaves, "the next steps will be very enlightening." The morning after the gala, Lakewood Terrace felt different. The sunlight seemed sharper, almost impatient, as if the world itself knew the Mitchells' carefully built facade was unraveling. I sipped my tea on the back porch, Ava resting in my arms, yawning in the warm light. Only 8 months old, she had no idea the storm around her had settled, but she felt safe, and that was enough. Madeline arrived mid-morning, face tired but resolute. I handed her a cup of chamomile tea. "This is it, Mom," she whispered. "No, darling," I said softly. "It's just the beginning." By noon, Monica Hayes was back at Clearview, reviewing the final batch of financial records. Calvin Brooks had compiled every piece of evidence: credit card fraud, payroll manipulations, vendor skimming, and unauthorized transactions, all directly tied to Sharon Mitchell, Ryan Mitchell, and Victor Mitchell. Each document time-stamped, every former employee corroborating. Their empire of deception was about to collapse. That evening, the Mitchells were summoned. Not with letters, not with vague threats, but by law enforcement. Police and federal investigators had all the evidence. Arrest warrants were ready. Victor Mitchell arrived first, trying to mask his fury with cold composure. Sharon followed, her usual arrogance faltering with every step. Ryan looked unsure, his confidence gone. They were led into a conference room where Monica Hayes waited, calm and precise, the living proof that their schemes had been uncovered. "Your fraudulent activities are documented," I said, my presence silent but commanding. "The accounts you manipulated, the credit cards you opened in someone else's name, the payroll schemes. You've committed multiple federal offenses. This ends tonight." Victor's jaw tightened. "This is impossible. You have no proof." I held up a folder. "Do not underestimate my patience. You thought you could manipulate my daughter, isolate her, and intimidate everyone around her. You were wrong." The officers moved in. Sharon was handcuffed first, her face pale. Ryan followed, unable to protest, every argument dead in his throat. Victor was last, his empire crumbling. The charges were severe: identity theft, wire fraud, embezzlement, and multiple counts of financial misconduct. Bail was denied. Their power, their money, their carefully crafted image, all meaningless now. 2 months later, the courtroom was packed. The public gallery buzzed with anticipation. Cameras were allowed for the civil proceedings, but the federal charges were strictly documented. The Mitchells sat together at the defendant's table, trying to maintain composure. I sat with Madeline, little Ava nestled in her stroller beside us. 8 months old, she stared at the courtroom ceiling with innocent curiosity, blissfully unaware of the weight of the day. The prosecutor laid out the case meticulously. Sharon Mitchell had orchestrated payroll manipulations and diverted funds through a shell company. Ryan Mitchell had aided in falsifying records to cover the embezzlement. Victor Mitchell had directly profited from unauthorized credit card transactions and wire fraud. Each detail was backed by Monica Hayes' meticulous documentation and sworn statements from former employees. Calvin Brooks presented the audit trail, linking each misappropriated dollar to the Mitchells. The defense attempted feeble excuses, claiming ignorance or oversight, but the evidence was airtight. The jury's expressions hardened with every piece of undeniable proof. When the verdict was read, the room fell silent. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty on all counts." Sharon's shoulders slumped. Ryan looked pale, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Victor's face, usually a mask of confidence, crumpled in silent rage. 2 weeks later, the judge delivered the sentences. Sharon Mitchell, 7 years in federal prison, fined $250,000. Ryan Mitchell, 5 years in federal prison, fined $150,000. Victor Mitchell, 10 years in federal prison, fined $500,000, and full restitution of all misappropriated funds. Justice had been served. Their empire of deceit was dismantled. Every stolen dollar would be accounted for. Every trust they had broken acknowledged and rectified. Later that evening, I returned home with Madeline. Ava slept peacefully in her crib, tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Madeline placed a hand on my shoulder, voice trembling. We did it, Mom. They can't hurt anyone else now. No, darling, I whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. We made sure they won't. We looked out at the backyard. The maple tree swayed gently in the night breeze. It had witnessed decades of life, joy, struggle, victories. Tonight it bore witness to justice. Some victories are loud. Some are quiet. But the most satisfying are the ones where the guilty are held accountable, and the innocent are protected. I held Ava close, letting her tiny hands grasp mine. She didn't need words to understand safety, and for once neither did we. Never underestimate a mother or a grandmother. Quiet, patient, and watching from the sidelines, she sees what others miss. Those who think they can deceive and control will always face the truth in the end. Strength, love, and vigilance are more powerful than lies. Always remember. Never doubt the woman who protects her family. Thank you so much for watching and supporting this story. Your time, comments, and love mean the world to me.